I'm delighted to be able to speak to the Portugal BPM Conference, and I'm going to be talking about digitizing healthcare, business process management's unique contribution. And I kind of nicknamed this talk Healthcare's Workflow Singularity. My name is Charles, or Chuck Webster. I'm president of EHR Workflow, Inc. I'm very active on Twitter, where I am Workflow, no W at the end, and there is my email. And feel free to use the hashtag HealthOS at any time during this presentation. I've been a proponent of workflow technology or business process management even before it was called BPM in healthcare for over 2 decades. You can think of me as Dr. Workflow on health IT social media. Blogging, Twitter, YouTube, Blab, Periscope, and I'm not above using humor. These are various characters that I play. Viva la Workflow and Dr. Workflow and so forth and so on. The Workflow King. Healthcare has hit what I call the workflow wall. There are many discontents in healthcare, and they are discontented with invisible, inflexible, ineffective, efficient workflow. And if you as business process management professionals say, well, wait a minute, we provide transparent, flexible, effective, and efficient workflow, well, yes, there's a great fit between healthcare's workflow problems and BPM's workflow solutions. So I'm basically going to talk about BPM in healthcare, and I'm going to kind of go back a bit, a few years, and then also go forward and predict what I think is going to happen. This is actually a quote from a blog post I wrote in 2009. Picture a graph that depicts progress toward higher and higher levels of market understanding of and appreciation for workflow management systems, EMR workflow systems, and business process management. So EMR stands for electronic medical record. And I actually did some qualitative analysis of workflow content at various conferences. The various colors represent the different conferences. And this was just my attempt to show an increase over the 2099 to 2009 decade. I've continued to track this and to promote business process management in healthcare. So for example, I just attended the America's Health Insurance Plans Conference. This is, the U.S. pays for healthcare differently than other countries. I'll get to more generic health IT in a moment, but my most popular tweet was this representation of all of the complexities of paying for healthcare in the U.S., and I mentioned the need for modern business process management. Now, do I think that all the folks who retweeted it and favored it understand business process management? Not necessarily, but they know that there is a problem, and the more the merrier. So they're welcome to new ideas. More on point, the Health Information Management and Systems Society Conference is held annually, and last year, most recently in Las Vegas, over 41,000 attendees. So it's the largest health IT conference in the U.S. And for the last 6 years, I have searched every single exhibitor website, which is about 1,350, can be like 1 million square feet. It's just an enormous exhibit hall. And I look for kind of workflow stories. And starting back 6 years ago, not much, then 2%, 4%, 8%, 16%, and now somewhere close to 50% of those 1,350 vendors have some kind of healthcare workflow story. We fit into your workflow, we make your workflow better, and so forth. Of that 1,350, I actually found 111 vendors that specifically mention workflow engine, business process, or business process management. The evolution of workflow technology in healthcare is similar to the evolution in other industries. It's just a lot slower. So if you've been around for a couple of decades, you know that at one time, data and business logic and user interface code were all mixed together in applications. Then we pull the data out into databases, and we manipulate or access that data through database engines. Then we pull the user interface out. So it used to be people drew from X1, Y1 to X2, Y2, a button, but now you just hand that off to the operating system. Say, draw a button, now we are in the process of taking workflow out and business logic out of these applications and storing them in databases and using workflow engines and decision engines to interpret them. Other industries are further along than healthcare. So obviously, business process management over there on the right is the most process-aware industry. That's because that's what it has to sell. Many other industries are crossing a kind of singularity. They are widely implementing declarative representations of workflow and work, and along with the workflow engines and other kinds of interpreting engines to make work more efficient and flexible. However, health IT is still just beginning to appreciate the need for workflow technology. So it's kind of moving from a workflow obliviousness to a kind of a dim awareness of the potential. It knows that there's a problem with workflow, not yet sure what to do, but open to suggestions, and that's a good thing. So I sometimes refer to that healthcare workflow wall as a workflow singularity. A singularity is, most folks popularly today associate it with the idea that when self-improving artificial intelligence comes along, then there'll be an explosion of technological innovation, and these AIs will run away and become really smart, and people are debating about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I refer to something called the workflow singularity. And the workflow singularity will occur when we have when a sufficient amount of our infrastructure and applications are based on representations of work and workflow that can be executed automatically and which can be instrumented so as to provide the workflow analytics to feed back in and to more systematically improve those workflows. Specifically, this singularity is pivoting on an emphasis almost solely on clinical data to a more equal emphasis on clinical data and clinical events driving workflows, representing those events, representing those workflows, and harnessing those representations, literally representing them in the computer to drive and to systematically improve a variety of throughput, reduce medical errors, improve user satisfaction with the systems, including patients. So what's happening now is we have basically boiled the ocean in terms of capturing data. We have more data than we know what to do with. But this data is in silos and in databases, and we are laying down on top of that a new workflow layer. Some of that workflow layer is health IT kind of reinventing the wheel, and some of that workflow layer is based on workflow technology and business process management, orchestration technology such as is present in the modern BPM industry. Now, just because the workflow layer is being laid down on the data layer doesn't mean that the data is the platform. The data is being consumed by the platform, and what's going to happen is that this new layer that's laying down on, that's coming down on top, that is going to become the platform on which a variety of workflow savvy applications that are interoperable, that are safer, that are more usable, and provide patients with a better experience with the healthcare system. So, predicting BPM's healthcare future. Well, I've been tracking this for over 2 decades, and I can say with great certainty that we will continue to see growing workflow and workflow tech thinking. People will think about, in health IT and healthcare, will think about workflow similar to the way that workflow technology and business process management and adaptive and dynamic case management professionals and vendors think about it. You will see a We have an incredible installed base of traditional health IT, data-centric databases with thin layers of user interface slapped on top, and they will retrofit workflow technology. They will add rudimentary workflow engines, and they'll also leverage third-party workflow technology. At the same time this is happening, we will see the so-called SMAC technology, social, mobile, analytics, and cloud, serve as vectors. A vector is an agent that brings an infection into a community. So social, mobile, analytics, and cloud, startups and initiatives from other enterprises increasingly are created through low-code application assembly techniques in the cloud, running on mobile without you having to write a lot of Objective-C Java code. And increasingly often, these have workflow engines, representations of workflow, and this workflow interacting with the business or the clinical logic. We are essentially heading for what I call full stack healthcare interoperability. Now, full stack refers to developers, someone who can install the operating system and run the databases and design the database models, and then on the front end, on the back end, on the front end, create the mobile applications and the code running in the browsers, as well as understanding the user and the design. So there's all those layers. They're all related. They're all required to work together, and so this person has kind of a hands-on knowledge and experience with each of those layers and how they fit together, which can be enormously valuable. And we need something that I call full-stack healthcare interoperability, which I'll discuss in just a moment. And then business process management isn't going to be the only new technology in healthcare. We're going to see a variety of new technologies, and BPM will interact with those new technologies. So it's useful to think about those interactions when you're predicting the future. And these include, in order of exoticness, application programming interfaces, the Internet of Things, and various kinds of distributed computing, including blockchain. Okay, what is full stack healthcare interoperability? Well, there are two popular terms in healthcare IT, which are syntactic interoperability and semantic interoperability. Both of these terms are borrowed from linguistics. By the way, I'm all but dissertation in computational linguistics, so I took many courses in syntax and semantics. Syntactic interoperability is the structure of the information that allows you to assemble it so that you can serialize it, send it someplace, and then parse it and retrieve the contents. Semantic interoperability is the interpretation of those contents. And the interpretation, the meaning, must be the same in both systems. So healthcare is a variety of coding systems for diagnoses and treatments, and drugs, and so forth. You rarely hear about something called pragmatic interoperability, although in the general IT and computer science community you'll find more material about that. Pragmatics is the next layer up in linguistics. So you have syntax, a structure of sentences, semantic, the literal meaning of a sentence, and then pragmatics, which is how we use words to achieve goals. That's the non-literal interpretation. And there, pragmatic interoperability is the match between the actual effect of a transmitted message and the intended effect of the transmitted message. So if I say something, I have a goal that I want to achieve in the world. If that goal is achieved, then pragmatic interoperability between us two humans is achieved. Similarly, when information is sent between one organization and another as part of a cross-organizational workflow, there's a goal of and that if that goal is met, then that's pragmatic interoperability. The most important context necessary to interpret these messages in context are goals, plans, workflows, tasks, and activities, which are just simply the bread and butter of the workflow technology, workflow management systems, business process management, and adaptive and dynamic case management software communities. So we'll start with API. First of all, modern APIs have been around for a long time, and healthcare is only just starting to adopt them. So right now we are creating a lot of data. We can move increasingly. We can move that data around and have it mean approximately the same thing. But in order for this new layer of workflow interoperability to function, it has to get at the data. It has to be able to pull that data. It has to be able to add to that data. And that is going to be through application programming interfaces. And so I kind of interchangeably talk about pragmatic interoperability, data use, and task workflow interoperability. Pragmatic interoperability is kind of like the linguistic theory, and task workflow interoperability is kind of the engineering. And by the way, an important application API is the FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, but it only encompasses a small subset of clinical data that will likely increase. There are many, many other APIs that are being created using, for example, modern automated API generation technologies to allow this new layer of pragmatic interoperability, task workflow interoperability to be laid down on top of the data interoperability layer. Okay, if you'd like to read more about these ideas of pragmatic interoperability and task workflow interoperability, you can go to ehr.biz. It's sort of my short URL utility, ehr.biz, pragmatic in one case and interop in the other case. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pause here for a second just in case anybody is writing that down. Okay. Now, what about healthcare plus the Internet of Things and business process management? If you cross-index on Google, BPM, and Internet of Things, you'll see a lot of interesting initiatives. That is, sensors are triggering state changes in little devices that are connected to the cloud, and this is being transmitted to some kind of orchestration engine. Folks are creating complex interoperable Internet of Things platforms, and you'll typically see the ability to draw data flows and workflows, and then some kind of workflow engine, possibly a community of workflow engines interacting with each other. Each of these little things is basically a CPU. It has some actuators, it has some sensors, and it has a way to communicate with other layers of the Internet of Things. And BPM will play an important role in making that possible. A big area of interest right now in health IT is getting outside of the electronic health record and the doctor's office and the office and into the home and the lives of individuals. So you're going to see more sensors in homes, ambient computing, wearables, and the amount of data and the complexity is so great that you're going to require workflow thinking in order to manage these systems. So this is an example actually of a process mind system of someone's, you might call life flow or home workflow. And you could easily imagine this, turning this into an actual executable representation and making things automatically happen, reminding folks to take their medications or detecting if the low-fat milk is low in the refrigerator and so forth. Okay, now the most exotic technology that seems to be in the offing is blockchain. And blockchain is a distributed database hardened against tampering. So I've got a copy of it, you've got a copy of it, other people have a copy of it, and changes to this database are essentially voted upon. Folks, if everybody agrees that, or above a certain percentage, agree that that this update is valid, then that gets replicated everywhere. Bitcoin, virtual currency, is based on blockchain, but blockchain is being suggested for a variety of other purposes, including in healthcare, for sometimes addressing, for example, healthcare interoperability, quote ownership, patient ownership of data. Blockchain will obsolete some workflows. So you think about having to go through a bank to get paid by a business partner versus having that automatically happen by virtue of the Bitcoins and blockchain smart contracts. These workflows will enable other workflows which will need to be managed. And so when you need to manage workflows, workflow technology seems like a good way to do it. So you'll see blockchain harnessing workflow technology in that way. And then there are some other interesting kind of connections between the two, and that is these databases do not contain just data; they also contain code, and much of this code are what are called smart contracts. These are the contracts that execute so that if you fulfill the necessary requirements of the contract, you automatically get paid. So it's a way of, in a sense, cutting out the lawyer or potentially the court. But by the way, these smart contracts are state machines. And so if you're familiar with kind of the theory behind workflow technology and business process management, under the hood you have models of workflow, and these are state machines essentially. The blockchain has implications for cross-organizational workflow. So I have a copy of the database, you have the copy of the database. They both replicate and stay consistent with each other. So that's relevant to cross-organizational workflow, therefore cross-organizational workflow in healthcare. And then blockchain is a fairly new technology, and it's really complicated. I mean, it's hard to write these contracts. It's hard to set up and do the kind of the DevOps necessary to set up blockchain systems. And so you'll increasingly see a variety of sort of blockchain process orchestration engines to support that. There's an Internet of Things angle, and that is when some little device out there interacts with some little device, you're going to see micropayments. So they will So if you'll give me a little bit of information about the weather, I'll pay you 1/10 of a cent automatically. And you don't. And at that level, it doesn't scale unless you can do it automatically. And then of course these blockchain systems will have their own application programming interfaces that if BPM will operate against, and if the data is healthcare data, then you're going to see an intersection with the API-ization of healthcare. So, in order to predict the future, you have to look into the past. So here we are in 2016, and 8 years ago, cloud, social networks, App Store, Google Chrome, financial crisis. Now you go all the way back to 2000. And I wrote a paper in 2000 and presented it at HIMSS, that conference I mentioned at the beginning, about 11 paperless physician offices. And it was, I believe, the first example of a clinical electronic health record based on a workflow management system. Now, I'm not going to make you read this text, but I did abstract a bit of it. So this is 16 years old. Now, keep in mind that what I'm going to be talking about here is incredibly well-known and understood and accepted and pro forma in the workflow technology industry. Back then, because I track this, nobody was talking about health IT or workflows in this fashion. And today, 16 years later, we're just starting to see systems that do this routinely. So let me start at the top here. Workflow automation refers to the automation of a business process in whole or in part, during which documents, information, or tasks are passed from one person to another for action according to a set of procedural rules. That should sound familiar. That is the definition from the Workflow Management Coalition. And then I talk about workflow systems, tasks, actors, roles, processes. I talk about workflow engines extensively elsewhere in the paper. Now keep in mind, 16 years ago, there was exactly, if you subtract this paper, there was almost virtually zero of this kind of conceptualization or technology. Now, what is the relevance of this to predicting the future? Well, a science fiction writer is quoted as saying, "The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed." So if you want to predict the future, you can go and find that local example of the future and then extrapolate. So what I wrote about here and presented here 16 years ago is coming true today in healthcare. So I would say that I've got some props here, some credibility. The other thing is health IT moves remarkably slowly, so that also makes it easier to predict the future. Now I want to mention. I really like this answer to Peter Schooff's daily BPM question from David Chessels. If David is here, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Now I'm going to read this, and it is IT supplies the infrastructure, hardware security, and the links into the legacy to be used by the new outside-in systems driven by BPM principles. Now, hold that phrase in mind. New outside-in systems driven by BPM principles. IT is not required to build this next generation of applications. The build is direct with users and their input is in their language. The leader in the build will be the business-focused, will be business-focused well within the business analyst skill set. In healthcare, you'll increasingly see clinically focused well inside the clinical analyst skill set. Now, at a conference last year, I saw Passion for Progress. His Twitter handle had this wonderful slide in which he was showing the relationship between customer journey, sales process, delivery process, and servicing process, and how the sales and delivery and the servicing workflows need to be driven by what's happening at the customer level. This is an example of outside in. And now we get to the prediction. Okay, so I'm going out on a limb. Of course, this is so far in the future that if I'm wrong, so what? I do hope to be around. I do archive this stuff and look back on it. I believe that in the next 8 years, you will see modern business process management enter the mainstream in healthcare and health IT. Healthcare BPM will leverage and be leveraged by FHIR and non-FHIR application programming interfaces, the Internet of Things, and blockchain. We will see major progress toward full-stack pragmatic interoperability, and the system behind the smiles become reality. The system behind the smiles is this idea that half of the interaction between a consumer or a patient and an organization or the healthcare system is due to the attitude, the culture, the personality of who they're dealing with, and half of it is due to the systems behind the smiles, whether they work or not. And those are the systems that we need to fix, and that business process management can help fix. And so the system behind the smiles will become a reality. Now we're really off into the distant future, although no farther into the future than in the past. When I talk about my 16-year-old presentation about clinical workflow systems, there will be technologies that, and new terminology that I can't. There's no way I wouldn't have the temerity to predict, but I do want to offer a kind of a concept, a kind of a steady state of where I think we're headed. And it's based on the analogy to an operating system. So I spend a lot of time arguing that we need more workflow and more process management, not just data. Well, what systems out there do both data and process as well? Well, the modern operating system. In fact, I've argued that the modern operating system is the single most important technological development of the second half of the last century. So where we are is down here at the bottom, data persistence. That's the syntactic and semantic interoperability layer. We are virtualizing that data through a layer of APIs and other technologies, and then we are adding on top of that a concurrency management layer. Concurrency, virtualization, and data persistence are the three main topics if you were to take a course, for example, in operating systems theory. And we're building a vast healthcare operating system. And we've partially mastered data persistence. We're starting on the virtualization necessary, and we're just in the beginning of starting to build the workflow and the process management component of the healthcare operating system architecture. I don't think, given that since the operating system idea has been around for a few decades, I don't think that this is going to be necessarily outdated in the year 2032 when we look back. Thank you very much. These are some of the ways to contact me. I'm chuckwebstermd, Gmail, and I'm on Twitter, very active on Twitter. I'm also on Blab, which is kind of like a talk show. Periscope, in fact, I'm periscoping this, and my Skype ID is chuckwebstermd. Thank you very much.